We are very excited to be here today. We've been planning this panel for a long time. My name is Lindsay Culkin. My pronouns are she, they. I'm the VP of AI Professional Services at DataRobot, and I'm also part of the Out in Tech New York City leadership team. And this is the lovely Bobby.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bobby Zip, and I am a data analytics and research professional at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office by day. And I'm also one of the moderators of the Responsible Ethical Tech channel in the Out in Tech Slack workspace. So I've been collaborating with the OIT New York City leadership folks to put this little idea that used to be in my head into reality. And I'm so excited that everybody's here and we're able to have these conversations, especially during Pride Month. So thanks to all of you for being here. And thanks to Arthur for letting us, hang out in your space and have this really exciting conversation. So thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Arthur, so much. And thank you, everyone, for being here today in person. And then we're also streaming with the global Out in Tech community. So we have folks checking in over Slack, over chat, over Zoom that Arthur is hosting for us, and have a great turnout here in person. Specifically want to give a shout out to GW, Victoria, Christina, Harrison, and Brett from Arthur, just doing such a tremendous job, not just lending this space to us. Yes, please. Many claps to them. Not just lending the space to us and sponsoring wonderful drinks and food, but also just being incredible thought partners as we think about how can responsible AI drive an impact with the LGBTQ+ community. It's very core to the Pride group at Arthur, and it's been wonderful to partner with that team to be able to put together this discussion that we're going to have today. So Arthur, you guys are amazing. Thank you. In terms of Out in Tech, is it anyone's first Out in Tech event today? Yes. Oh, amazing. That's a high amount, actually. That's amazing. So for folks, maybe you don't know a lot about Out in Tech, who aren't me and Bobby and our wonderful volunteers that are here today. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a core mission to unite the LGBTQ+ tech community. And we do this by creating opportunities for our 40,000 members, to be able to drive innovation through networking, through advancing their careers, but also leveraging tech for social change. What's better than that? Gotta get water.
Not exiting.
Not exiting.
Okay. False alarm.
Needed water. What's the other plug we need? Join the Slack channel.
Yeah.
So, me. Been talking too much, I think, today. Bobby runs Ethical Tech. Please join the Slack channel. You can join there. You can also join AI machine learning data science, which is what Victoria and I are in. And there's also fun events like entertainment for RuPaul's Drag Race fans. So join Slack. It's very fun. If you are looking for a job, there's also outintech.com/jobs. Plenty of job postings there. If you are interested in a job that's posted, email corporate@outintech.com. That's Q, not a C. And they will put in a good word for you once you've applied. And if you just want to get involved, feel free to talk to me, Akila, Bethany, Brian, Eduardo. There's lots of volunteers here. Miyako, I see you in the back. So feel free to talk to any of us or join our website online. So with that, I'll hand it over to GW, who will tell you a little bit about Arthur, and we'll be moderating our panel. Give it up for GW.
Thanks, Lindsay and Bobby, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We're super excited to be hosting Out in Tech and being partners with you guys on this. Arthur is, really invested in responsible AI and ethical AI. It's a part of our mission. I'm going to tell you just like a little bit about what we do. And by the way, I'll introduce myself and tell you a little bit about what I do. Happy to have conversations with you. Arthur's an AI performance company, and our mission is to make AI better for everyone. So our platform, what it does is monitors, measures, and improves machine learning models to deliver better results across accuracy, explainability, and fairness. In addition to exclusive monitoring capabilities in areas like computer vision, NLP, and bias mitigation, we also recently launched Shield, the first firewall for LLMs. We're super excited about that. So there are a lot of our team members here who are pivotal in launching that. If you're ever interested, look for somebody with Arthur on the name tag, and they're happy to talk to you a little bit more about that. The work that we do at Arthur as a part of our mission, it's actually acutely focused on responsible and inclusive innovation. It's something that we're really passionate about, and it's actually a large reason of why I decided to join Arthur. I wanted to work for a company that was really focused on how we view technology and how we can use technology to empower as many people as possible. So that's something that's really excited. I know that I and others are also very internally focused on building an inclusive and equitable culture so that we can actually make that happen outwardly. So again, it made a lot of sense for us to partner with Out in Tech. We're honored to be a partner there, and excited to be able to help you facilitate this panel. Want to talk a little bit about the panel and what the format will be before we bring our awesome panelists up. We'll be asking a few questions to get in-depth insights from them in their areas of expertise. And then we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A. And for those joining us virtually, welcome and thanks for tuning in. Be sure to share your questions as well in the chat. We'll be checking to include those. So without further ado, I'd like to bring our panelists up to the stage and have them introduce ourselves. Please give them a round of applause. Yeah, and through all that rambling, forgot to properly introduce myself. So I'm Genesis. I go by GW. My pronouns are she, her. I'm head of talent at Arthur. So again, if you're interested in now or in the future, thinking about opportunities at Arthur, I'm the person to talk to. Easy to remember my email address. It's genesis@arthur.ai. Probably pretty easy to find on LinkedIn as well. So always happy to connect. Come find me if you're interested. So let's introduce our panelists. Michael.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Madaio. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a research scientist at Google in the Responsible AI and Human-Centered Technology organization.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. For the first time ever. No, I'm just kidding. My name is Victoria Vassileva. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior account director here focused on AI and ML strategy, but more specifically advancing AI performance and responsibility, primarily with Fortune 100 companies, but not exclusively. It's nice. Thank you all for coming. I work here at Arthur too, and I work with GW, so please join us.
Hi everyone, happy Pride. My name is Remy. My pronoun is he, him. I'm a regional VP of data science practice for DataRobot. I actually work in Lindsay's team. So at DataRobot, I've been helping customers working on how to leverage end-to-end machine learning AI platform to solve real-world business problems. So in my company, I'm actually support a lot of LGBTQ plus activities. Today at 12 today, I was hosting the Pride Month PrideBot Collective celebration. So I'm really looking forward to talk with you all and share my perspective about how AI and responsibility is interacting together. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dressendoerfer. I'm a technical specialist for data and AI and a cognitive solution architect at IBM. And my role here in New York, so I'm from Germany, everyone, and I just moved here, is now I'm account technical leader, and I'm especially focusing on the strategies for my accounts and how we use AI and quantum computing and all these kind of fun things to integrate them in the strategy.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Really excited to dive in. Let's get into it. I know why we're all here today. Obviously, the topic of this panel is really thinking about responsible and inclusive technology. So each of you have a very specific, unique perspective, area of expertise on that. We'd love to go down the line and hear what responsible and inclusive technology means to you. Why don't we start with you, Michael?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for me, it involves incorporating values throughout the design process of AI machine learning systems, and specifically values like fairness, making sure that systems work equally well for all people, for different groups of people, making sure that they're accessible, and in particular that we're involving communities in the design of systems. So I think there's often approaches to data collection, model training, system development that are very divorced from the contexts where those systems will be used or the communities who will use or be impacted by those. And so responsible AI, to me, really means engaging with the communities who might be impacted, taking their perspectives into account, and ideally not developing or deploying systems that might be harmful to those communities. But I think that starts within development processes and having organizations that are able to engage with communities, that listen to employees who are raising issues, and there's many incentives and reasons organizationally why that might not be the case.
It's difficult to add much more to that. Thank you for capturing it so well. I would agree. I want to also credit the disability community who originated one of the notions of, nothing for us without us, right? And so this speaks to divorcing that. And I think, one kind of modern day example of that would be, if I can do a land acknowledgement at this moment, right? We're sitting on the land of the Lenape people who probably have no input whatsoever into StreetEasy's algorithms deciding how much this land is worth, right, in a given property statement. So I think those kinds of considerations, and yeah, I love what you said at the end, which I was going to say as well, which is sometimes when you start with this kind of clinical word of like a use case, right? What you aren't asking or should be asking, at least to be responsive and inclusive, is like, do we need machine learning behind this? Should we be automating these decisions at all, and perhaps not doing it? And I think it takes reckoning with the tension between notions or values and, say, systems like capitalism, and that's a topic for another day, but it is important to recognize, right? Because what is driving the incentives, and this is all part of the system this gets developed in. And I think until we acknowledge the broader systems in place to make informed design choices and decisions, because there are human decisions along the entire way. And that's a good thing, but we also have to ask who gets to participate. So yeah, ditto plus what I just said.
Thank you. I want to add one more point. So I think in regards to responsible AI and inclusiveness in AI and machine learning, especially generative AI, is access to resources. I think that's the creation of inclusiveness. When you have access to resource, you're more included, you're able to develop and grow in the technology domain you're interested with. One example, I've been using ChatGPT every single day, refining my accountants, write script. I was actually telling my report that I will give you something in 2 hours, and then ChatGPT helped me in 5 minutes, and he's shocked at how fast I can write script, even though it's not mine. And also it's really good at translation, right? Break the barrier gap in communication. All those benefits introduced by AI or generative AI is only accessible by people who have access to those tools, right? Think about people who don't have internet, don't have money to pay for this license of ChatGPT, or their organization or country ban this technology. That will create a bigger gap in regards to how people can grow with this new technology. So, and also access to knowledge, right? I'm a data scientist from education and my professional working experience as well. I feel me naturally can understand this technology better and quicker. But when I'm explaining this to other people, I feel like I don't really have that resonation from my audience. So I start to write articles about like demystifying what's transformer, what's attention, what's reinforcement learning with human feedback. I think that's important for technology industry to explain this to a broader public so people can join this conversation and also can join the conversation and share their fear, their hope, their passion about this. And that will like fostering a much better community. Last but not least, about access to resource, I think is about resource to talents and computational resource. Think about all the big tech companies have all the talented experts able to train a large language model, and also the compute resource, the GPUs, they can acquire through NVIDIA and get their stock price extremely high, is very concentrated. So if that trend is growing, there will be a monopoly happening in the industry. So that will definitely reduce the amount of inclusiveness. I think more competition, more regulation will definitely be helpful to get resource more accessible to people.
Okay, great. What do I add? That's been like very insightful, folks. So thank you for that. I think the only thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is transparency and making sure the systems, we know why they react that way, why they're making a decision, and what kind of confidence levels they all have. So I think that would be the only thing I want to add to make a transparent, robust, and kind of fair algorithm we're building.
Awesome. Thanks for those answers. Actually, Ray, would love for you to keep the mic. One of the things, like as a follow-up into that and thinking about everybody's perspectives, particularly, you were speaking very specifically about ChatGPT and just applications there. As a broader question, made me think about like responsible, inclusive technology, specifically, ethical AI applications. Why do you think like being responsible, why do you think being inclusive with that technology is important in today's digital landscape?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that's important, not just in the digital landscape, important to everyone here, every single person who's interacting with the internet. I think one thing is those very pervasive and transformative technology is trained on a huge amount of data, and those data contain their bias there. So if you ever search using ChatGPT, asking a question about a nurse, and the pronoun ChatGPT will use will be primarily she or her. Or if you ask ChatGPT, or if you search in prompting Midjourney, the text to image generation tool, I personally did one. I want to create an image of a room of people doing manual labeling work for reinforcement learning. And the image that Midjourney created more around concentrated on people of color. Which definitely those models, when it's learning from large amount of data in history, it carries those stereotypes and bias, which is one of the hardest problems to solve. There are like different metrics in language model and generative AI in regards to accuracy, robustness, fairness, efficiency, but bias is the one that is really hard to mitigate because it's just there, it's very pervasive, right? So if this trend is carrying over to the future development, the compounding effect will just make it even worse. So I think it's why it's pressing and also urgent is we need to act now. We need to get more underrepresented classes into this game. We need to get more fair or equal hiring process so we can get the future training data with more representation, with better representation of the class that is underrepresented in the current world, which the quicker we can act on that, the sooner we can correct the bias in the history and solve this problem before it's getting worse and worse.
And Michael, I know this is something that you also specifically are focused on in your role. Tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so I think we're at a particularly fraught moment for this as more of our lives move online into digital spaces, particularly in the last several years. I think there's a lot of opportunities for digital traces of our behavior, of our relationships, of our interactions that are logged, captured, used for surveillance purposes, used to then train large models. So I think, Ray, building off of what you were saying, I think there's important questions to ask as this pressure to train larger and larger models faster at larger scales leads companies, organizations to want to extract larger data sets to train those models on. That I think brings with it very real risks for visibility. And here, this is out in tech, it's Pride Month, thinking about queer lives. I think there's a lot of really difficult questions about visibility in online spaces and what that means for the kinds of data that is generated and how that's used to train models. So one way I think about, and I guess the other aspect of this particular moment is the rush to use AI systems in many, many different use cases in high stakes settings, some of which are in public sector agencies. So there's government agencies using machine learning models to prioritize who gets access to child welfare services, or rather, maybe more punitively, which families are flagged as high risk by child welfare systems and thus subject to greater scrutiny or carceral logics, punishment, right? And all of these sort of use cases that people are excited about using AI systems for, including generative AI, but also more traditional classification models, bring with them particular domain specific risks and challenges that I think often I say we, but often I think the AI community gets caught up in the excitement about a new use case or a new sector we can use this in without adequately evaluating what the risks might be. And so the connection to the sort of questions of visibility of queer lives, there's a great phrase from Dean Spade, who talks about this idea of administrative violence, and so how states and state actors and governments commit violence through the ways that they capture people's identity in various administrative forms, and how that sort of fails to represent people in authentic ways. And so, for instance, like trans folks who need to think about how their identity is captured in government forms and documents, and how that might not sort of be reflected in the databases or the data structures, or there might be things sort of like historical data traces of their dead names in various places. And I think there's a lot of these kinds of questions about visibility, about surveillance, about data usage, and high stakes applications that it's important to think carefully about. And I worry about these sort of rush to deploy systems that at a pace where that kind of thoughtful evaluation is maybe not valued.
Yeah, so thinking about those points, Michael, and the rush, to that deployment, really kind of moving forward with those use cases. I think one of the things that we discuss is really thinking very specifically, like in those usages, in that rush to kind of deploy this, like how companies and individuals in those companies can really work to promote responsible and inclusive practices in technology development. I know, Victoria, you had some thoughts on that. What are some of your perspectives on like how companies can be thinking about that?
Yeah, I think, there's several ways to answer this, because there's individual levels, there's culture levels kind of inside of companies. There's also thinking about ways your product can be more, or your product or your service even can be more inclusive. It can be as small and simple as including pronouns in your forms, or when you introduce yourself, right? As subtle nudges, not making those assumptions when you interact with other people at other companies. From a product perspective, just to piggyback off of your example around, how the trans community has to think about their identity. We saw MasterCard a couple of years ago allow people to choose their name and their pronouns on their cards, which is huge coming from a brand with such reach and visibility, right? It made a really strong statement. And so that's one way you can kind of think about as a brand and a service, ways to be more inclusive. Just kind of sticking with financial services, right, in this space, because it's so life determining, right? When we interact with institutions, and it determines whether we get loans, what we get approved for, do we get a house and a mortgage or a car even, right, to get to certain, to our job perhaps, do we get hired at that financial institution? The ways we show up in the data, there's this, like we learn so much in real time, but it's not before hundreds of thousands, if not millions of folks have already been affected by it, right? So one example famously in this space is you cannot use zip code as an input, because the United States has a very long history of redlining, right? So zip code became a really effective one-to-one kind of proxy for all kinds of demographic data, which was as good as including that kind of through like fairness through an awareness, which is another topic thing. But even with that, right, other proxy variables are like authorized user, because in this country, the community known as women couldn't have bank accounts or credit if they weren't married to a man who had access to that credit. And so authorized user ended up being discovered as another proxy variable for, what was happening, what these models were determining for them. There's also this notion of the undercredited or non-credited, right? And so this is something I've personally lived through, being an immigrant in this country, where you don't just, no one hands you credit cards that easily. And so my first credit card was actually through my first girlfriend at the time, who, took a chance adding a 20-something, to like an unlimited credit card. But that was literally how I got my first credit card. But there's lots of people you can imagine, undocumented folks, people who don't come from families with bank accounts even, right, who operate on cash only, and this digitization that you spoke about, where, now we have Zelle, Cash App, Venmo, you name it, right, tap to pay, reduce the friction, right? But like, who are you reducing it for? Who gets to benefit from the ease and the automation and the scalability of these services? Because right now, if you could ask for some assistance to buy someone food here, or they ask for money on the train, right, these performers even, and like I don't carry cash, and that is political, even if it's not an intentional choice, right? And so AI kind of steps in and automates a lot of this. And unless you're thinking about it or know enough to think about it, I don't think it's intentional harm most of the time in terms of like how you and I choose to use tools in our lives. But it's complicated, right? And so ways to bring this back to the question would be just to try to think about these things, right? Ask yourself, what are the knowns and what are the unknowns, and what are the known unknowns and then the unknown unknowns, and try to do your best just to anticipate how you might produce certain harm or how different groups might interact with it. And then if you do put this out into the world, look for that along the way, right? And bringing in other folks and other, whether it's disciplines or the communities that you're making decisions for, these are all ways that you can be more inclusive.
Kim, I know you had thoughts on this as well.
Oh, I can tell you my story about getting a bank account here without a social security and all these kind of things. Another story for after. Anyway, no, I'm on the same page. I think it's highly crucial. And what we do at IBM, for example, we have to go through an ethical committee to kind of like learn about processes and how we build code, right? So every time we build something, we get data and all these kind of things from different clients. We as employees and developers, especially, like we have to learn how do you deal with it, like similar to what every doctor has to go through, like in the typical ethical committee, like what is right, what is wrong. We do that at IBM as well with our code. And so every time it arrives, like I have to do an assessment. I have to do my learning once a year to make sure like I'm on the ethical side. I know what's happening with data. I know what's in the data, like also have to learn about the impact, what happens if I do something with it and what happens if I do something wrong with it. Like talking about data breaches, how crucial they are, and what we have to do. And I think if we want to move ahead, some of those mechanisms are highly crucial to make sure like all of us are aware of it. Because it's not that we want to make mistakes and we want to create a data breach. It's more like about what don't we know, what do we need to learn. And there are many processes in this huge organizations, right, which we cannot control. So it's very important that we learn about it. And the other thing, what I think is extremely important and also future-wise, next 5 to 10 years, we don't know what kind of regulations are coming in. We don't know what kind of regulations are decided. From an IBM perspective, is like we have to test our system for bias. We have to make sure that the data sets, especially what you mentioned with the financial data, for example, that there's equal set of all groups basically, and we got to make sure like all of these data sets are like fair, unbiased, and we go through them. And that has a step of like, obviously we use a lot of unsupervised learning data, but it forces us to use supervised data. Supervised data, and especially trained data, with data labels. So this is very important for us. And I think if we create a mechanism where this becomes kind of natural and in a kind of like fluid way and integrated in all the processes, we will have a different kind of look at it, and we will see huge benefits basically.
Awesome. I mean, I think it's clear based on all of your answers that you definitely have unique insights here and a lot of experience insights into how, AI can be viewed in the space, how we can be responsible. But there's also, there's a lot of conversation just in everyday talk about how AI, particularly amongst other technology, is being used on a day-to-day basis. And there's a lot of noise, in different areas. There's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of fear, which, can be reasonable in terms of like how people are thinking about how AI can be deployed for harm or for good. And so one of the bigger questions, particularly thinking about, people in this room, people like us who are, underrepresented, marginalized in different ways, and particularly wary of the ways that these can be used. Would love to hear from each of you about, thinking about technology, like how do we see responsible and inclusive tech contributing to a more equitable society? I know there's different angles of that, but love to hear your perspectives. Particularly starting with you, Michael. I know that you are acutely aware of like some of the potential harm and misconceptions there. So would love to kind of hear about your perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for me, one of the biggest questions is how do we decide what to build and what not to build? And I think to your question of like what responsible technology development processes or responsible tech can do, to make more equitable society, equity for LGBTQ people in particular, I think there are a lot of rose-tinted glasses that get put on during tech development, product development processes that, you know, we all want to believe the things we're building will help people. At least like reading that generously, right? People, let's say, you know, think about the positive benefits, but I think too often we in technology development, product teams don't spend as much time perhaps envisioning the harms, envisioning what could go wrong. So as part of my role at Google, the team that I work on and we develop processes to help support teams in doing this kind of envisioning work early in the design process. But part of it too, as we were talking about before, is engaging with communities, getting their feedback, getting their participation. And ideally for me, I think, you know, one of the biggest decisions is going to be, you know, should we build this or not? Should this use AI or not? And you know, one example I often bring up in this space, there probably about 5-6 years ago now, there were researchers who developed this computer vision model that they claimed could identify people's sexual orientation from images of their faces. It didn't work. It can't work. It's not possible. It's modern day phrenology. It's physiognomy. And yet there are AI developers, AI researchers who believe that a tool like that should exist, and to hear them tell it, that it would be beneficial to queer people. And I really wonder if they actually talked to any queer people as part of that development process. And you know, you sort of go down the list, and there's other examples of things like that, you know, even in the education space, for instance, there are tools that are being designed to ostensibly to support children's safety that end up outing queer students, right? These are sort of school like monitoring, school quote safety monitoring algorithms that inadvertently out students to teachers and parents and things. So I think this question of envisioning what could go wrong, thinking about the consequences is really important. And the other piece too is even when developing like mitigations or solutions for these, we need to be thinking about how those could also go wrong or have unintended consequences. So one example, for instance, there's been a bunch of algorithms to detect hate speech or toxicity in online communities. Okay, at face value seems great, right? We want to support you know, more healthy, less toxic online discourse, and yet some of those algorithms have been found to erroneously flag speech from drag queens, speech from queer people as being toxic or as being hate speech. So they get flagged as, you know, false positives at disproportionate rates. Meanwhile, queer slurs and speech is not flagged by those algorithms. So that's just one example. There's other like block lists people use to block quote hateful or toxic content that ends up filtering out queer identity words. Like if you say I am queer, I think some of those people recognize and fix, but again, thinking about what could go wrong even when you are trying to address potential harms.
Victoria, I'd love to hear a little bit. I know that you were thinking about in all of this and thinking about those potential harms. What are some ways that you think about the space and ways for potential good or areas for, you know, improving the lives of queer identified people?
Yeah, I think this came up a little bit earlier in terms of like kind of the collective consciousness, I think, is rising, which is net good, right? Because you mentioned, right, you have to educate, how do you interact with the public? And some of this ties into transparency as well. So that's kind of step one. But with that, one of the effects is things like bringing more for this particular community, queer founders into spaces. And I'll give one specific example of a company that I think is doing it really well. And unfortunately, recently shuttered their doors because they were started kind of during COVID times, which is another example of how life events affect groups differently, right? These are all factors, but what they did was, you know, here's a group that is historically marginalized and shows up differently in data for a number of reasons, right? There's a lot of intersections in the queer community along, you know, racial and ethnic lines, as well as gender identity, so on and so forth, immigration status, et cetera. All these things that even today, like you mentioned, right, we should absolutely be assessing our models for fairness, but we can only do that with the labels that we are boxed into, right? So anyone who has more than one race or more than one gender identity or non-binary identity doesn't show up in that data, so will not be present in fairness assessments either. But back to this example, there was, they were called Daylight. They transitioned to a different name because they saw in their data that, you know, one of the biggest challenges, for example, for this community is how we have children, right? It might be incredibly expensive. We might live in states like Texas, where I spent 25 years, that go out of its way, right, to make it extremely difficult, depending on what, from a biological standpoint, I can bring to the table, the access to certain, you know, the other components that I need, whether or not this is covered by my insurance, both from a medical perspective, but even from a mental health perspective, right? This is all over the board, and generally, in fact, there's, you know, of all the states that are banning right now, certain healthcare for people who identify as women and other, you know, people can give birth, and there's zero overlap with the states that also offer paid family leave, right? So these are all decisions that get baked into data, get baked into algorithms, get baked into how you show up in a number of places, which have domino effects, right? If I have a baby and I step out of the workforce for a while, what does that mean for my earning potential in my prime earning years, which is a horrible term, but is real, right? And so from positive though standpoint, it's like these things do exist, right? So I want to point to, there are folks like us, like you all, engaging with these topics, who bring it not only awareness to it, but solutions, right? So you can do better, you can create data, you don't have to just take what's there, right? We can reject that things have to be done the way they've always been done. And I think the accessibility aspect, I do have contention with sort of the notion of the democratization of certain tools. At the same time, increasing access to them is important, right? There's a lot there, but with that, it does mean that you and I today are more empowered with access to education, with access to tools, to create the solutions that we want, right? So I would encourage everyone here to imagine what you could create and what could solve your problems. And I think that's the biggest benefit that I personally see now, because a lot of people are talking about ChatGPT, interacting with it. I don't think we've seen something quite as accessible since basically the smartphones, right? That everyone of all ages, you know, I think we can point to several people in our lives that are doing it. And I think I want to focus on the positive, as long as the awareness of, you know, potential harms are in it, but you have the power within you.
Awesome. And so thinking about the future, I'd love to hear a little bit about trends and developments that we find most promising in the space, that you find most promising in the space. I know that, Ray, you were thinking about some insights there in relation to regulation. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. So before I worked at DataRobot in the tech and AI startup industry, I was working with HSBC for 5 years. I was dealing with a lot of regulation requirements, risk analytics. So I've been like getting involved in like the regulation domain. And before generative AI or AI in general become pervasive, what I see is regulation is more coming from the industry vertical. Like for banking and financial services, you have Federal Reserve Bank, you have Office of Comptroller of Currency. For medical, healthcare, and life science, you have FDA to regulate all this big pharma. And gradually things change because AI, machine learning, generative AI becomes so pervasive. It's really hard to monitor through a specific industry. So there are more standalone practice around AI regulation popping up from different regions, countries, continent. So I think that's one transformation I've been observing. And good news in regards to what's pressing, what's like emerging, what's the good aspect of the transformation is those regulators are forced to build more regulation laws, legislation, and best practices to guide the industry to follow the right practice. Reason being, we see all this hallucination and fear and doubt in the market, and also generative model can do really bad thing that give you a perfect lie. So regulators are also acting on that. You see like the EU AI Act. Also, there are different federal state level laws in the US as well. For New York, more specifically, there will be a local law 144 is already effective since January 1st this year, but will be enforced next Wednesday. So that law is about bias assessment on AI-driven decision for hiring. So if you're using AI bots to decide which resume you want to filter out or process to next round, that specific practice will be subject for assessment. So I think those are good trends in this industry in general, with more regulation, more robust way to monitor and manage monitor the behavior of those AI solution and manage their cost, their benefit, and their risk. I think that will be good for this industry to develop in the longer term.
And Kim, your thoughts as a tech leader, would love to hear, like, what do you see in the space in terms of innovation and growth there?
How much time do we have? Are you guys ready? No, I mean, like my colleagues mentioned earlier, one of the greatest thing about AI is that it's accessible for almost everyone, and there's so much learning in it. And with that comes the system getting more knowledge. And with that also comes like we can cross over language barriers to generate even more knowledge. And I think like that's what one of the things I see, that companies are now able to actually like access documents all over different languages. And one of the trends we're seeing is, especially in the health industry, like all of a sudden we can access data from completely different countries in cancer research, right? We can open so much more new perspectives of what different treatment has been happening in Japan and what's working in Colombia. We know all of that now because like it's accessible. The other one advantage is that since the machine is so much more able to read and goes into so much more dimensions of depth, we see different kind of conclusions with it. We can find out way quicker, oh, this treatment might be working for this specific kind of cancer. So all these kind of things are coming in. And so health is one massive industry. And the other thing I'm working in, so I can give you some knowledge there, is like agriculture. Like we are finding out so much more, like how we need to be more resourceful, what we need to do, when to water which kind of plant based on what kind of weather data. We have so much more information, so much more sensor data in everything we can build in, right? I mean, like all the houses now, we can build in like little sensors that are able to detect the fire way quicker, you know, like all these kind of trends are coming in, and the more easiness and the more, I don't know, like, I don't know the English word for that, but it's just like amazing. And yeah, that's one thing. And I mean, like you've been seeing a lot with automotive, what's happening right now, right? A lot of new things coming up. And the other thing, what's especially happening right now is like a lot of new quantum computing. So it's a new processing power, right? We can bring in, we can solve problems very quicker, and then we can analyze them again with AI and machine learning and large language models, whatever you want to put on it. So there's a lot of new drugs coming out, new medicaments, like new all these kind of trails. So it's been very, very fascinating. And I know like lots of folks, and there's just like a lot of fear when it comes to these kind of topics, right? But I also want to make sure like there's so much potential as well. And if we use it the right way, if we bring in the right regulations, right? If we train the people properly, I think this will be something so beneficial for our future. And we will, like, if we are able to cure whatever disease we have just based on more knowledge we have, I think that's already a huge benefit for all of us. And I mean, like, yeah, fuck cancer.
You know, that is a good sentiment to end on. Definitely fuck cancer. So we've gotten a lot of great insights from our panelists. We do have time for Q&A. So I'd love to open it up to the audience here. And also, again, if you are participating virtually, we're monitoring there. So if we could get mics around to some of our so why don't we start? Do we see hands? Oh, right here. Here we go.
Hi, thank you for your comment earlier. I kind of want to touch upon the topic on AI, the impact on the workforce. So we've been talking a lot about actually how a lot of like retraining and education industry in general is just not ready for that. And where do you see the next like 5 to 10 years? I mean, McKinsey just has a report on like the productivity, but I mean, a lot of like access to AI require more education, and then the current system just does not cope with that kind of system. Where do you see the future trend will go based on that? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a number of dimensions of that. So one, I think to your point of like for workers thinking about how they might need how they might be asked to use AI or feel incentivized to use AI as part of their work. I think the other, to this question, the previous question around like exciting trends, I actually think one of the things that excites me the most about this particular moment is rising collective action and worker organizing. And you see this across a couple of sectors in response to some of the sort of drives, the sort of business pressures to use AI in for art generation, for instance, or in you see like the Writers Guild, right? Like naming AI as one of the concerns in their bargaining. But there's other industries like in education where teachers are grappling with what this means for education. And so I guess I would reframe that question just a bit from the sort of like, AI is inevitable, AI is going to permeate every industry, and ask what sort of worker power we might have to think about what the role is for AI in these industries. And maybe it's, there are some parts of our work that perhaps can be automated, but maybe there's some of the work that we do across industries that is fundamentally human and that we should not offload to machines. And so I think there's going to be, sector level, like domain, industry level questions about what that means for particular types of work and sectors. But I am hopeful and optimistic about the power of collective action and worker organizing to drive those conversations rather than being driven top down for what's most cost effective. Because I think you're seeing this with companies, for instance, laying off their workers and ostensibly replacing them with AI, and then perhaps realizing a few days later in some situations that actually the AI can't do all of the things that it thought it could. And so maybe, there's questions of was that perhaps a pretense? Who knows? And so this is where I think there's roles for workers in pushing back.
We have a question over here.
Oh God. I'm just wondering how you guys combat, like on a nitty-gritty level, about how to deal with the algorithmic bias. So for example, like all of these responsible AI panelists have white shoes. So how would you deal with combating that? So like, would you delete this data set? Not you, of course, like how would you delete that data set? Would you input more data sets with like different color shoes? Like how would that look like? You know what I mean? Okay.
Yeah, I'll start with a little bit of color and then pass it to you because I know you raised your hand to answer. The thing about asking, dealing with bias, right? You have to contextualize it, and you have to ask like which value you're trying to measure for, right? So in this case, this may be completely out of context for the decision that you're trying to make, right? So we don't include in my credit decisioning model my hair color or my height, right? Because those have no bearing and should have no bearing. So you should ask like, is this relevant to the question or not? And then what type of bias, right? From a statistical sense, there's good bias and bad bias. From a socio-political one, it's much more fraught, right? And so we have to, you can't just say, how would you eliminate this bias? What is the bias, right? Do we want equal representation? Do we want demographic parity amongst, shoe colors or something else?
No, yeah, I think that's spot on. So I just want to summarizing this. So I think there are different steps for bias process. So you detect first, you assess, and then you act, right? So you detect there's some facts exist here. Assess wise, not a big problem, so you won't act on that. But I think like modern technology should build that framework to detect bias, and then think about how to assess the bias by parity, different parity metrics, equality matrix, and then act on top of that. It could be just tell the builders there's a problem, or even proactively act on that to correct the things on an ongoing basis. So yeah, that's just my general framework about how bias can be detected and mitigated through the entire process.
Any other questions? We have a couple. Let's get that, and then we'll work our way back this way.
Oh yeah. Oh my God. You briefly touched on the topic of ethics of people who are building those systems. And yeah, people are an important part of building anything, especially ethical AI. And since we're all people, we're all biased. Sometimes because we're not a part of the specific marginalized community. And what could be done or should be done on institutional level and individual level to improve that? Like, what could we do to maybe help or force, air quotes, our colleagues to be more mindful about building image recognition service that outs queer people? Yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure if I understood it right. So basically, like, how should you do, like, how should, say that again, sorry.
Yeah, what can be done to improve how people building those AI systems, how they approach this process, how they make decisions to avoid those biases or making those unethical decisions?
Yes, so there are some systems already existing that are able to detect what bias is in the system, and they even give you recommendations now how you need to change your data set to make it less biased, and gives you like the right data set to make sure. The other thing which is like really interesting what you mentioned is like there are some things called AI facet sheets. They help you make sure that every data you have in it is in the right way labeled, and every model you're using at the end is the right one you want to use it for. Because at one point, right, if you look at like bigger use cases and bigger kind of programs, right, there are more models in than what we think it is, and sometimes it's hard to keep track on it. So it's very important that you create a mechanism, that you have a system in control that checks those models and make sure the right models goes into the right thing. Let's take the shoe example, right? You don't want to have that shoe example in a different kind of use case built in. All these kind of things are very important. So coming back, yes, you have to have a mechanism, and you got to make sure that those data you have and those models you build are proved and bias, like without bias. But that's when it comes back to like, just like, I think 5 pillars of like robustness, transparency, fairness, privacy, and explainability. Thank you. Thank you. So those are the pillars. You gotta like, this is what you have to, this is the mechanism you control it with. So if you go through these 5 pillars, all of these 5 pillars have different control mechanisms. If they all get the check mark, then your algorithm most likely will be without any biases. Does that answer your question? I'm so sorry. But okay, we take that.
We have a hand over here.
Hi, great panel. My question is, do you think responsible AI has a place in recruitment?
So I'm not a panelist, but I'm happy to answer this. The bias in me, ironically, says there has to be an obvious balance, which is why I do agree that there needs to be regulation there for sure. One of the things, interestingly, as like somebody who's in talent, is like I've recently been getting a lot of messages about, hey, we want you to utilize, our product. It makes it very easy to hire. We use AI. And it's very surface level, right? Very shiny, like that new, kind of logo on there. And it's very interesting because I would think at times, like working, when they realize that I work for an AI monitoring company, that they might do a little bit more due diligence and say like, hey, how are you what's observability like for your product? Fairness, like how are you actually mitigating these very real issues, for example, that are filtering out candidates based on name or based on very specific keywords. A lot of the software that like I've used in the past at different companies have done that. And they use it, right, for efficiency. Like, hey, I'm at a company, I have 4,000 resumes. I need an easy way to filter through that. But one of the issues there, again, is how are those trained models actually looking for the things that you want and not filtering away a lot of candidates that could actually be promising. So for me personally speaking, I'm a very analog person. I actually, even if there's a high volume, I think it's like very important to kind of think about the human element to it. I think one of the panelists said very earlier, like there's a lot of ways in which people try to automate things and say, hey, we can use AI to do this. but there's a human element to that has to be able to like pick that up. And so I guess like from that certainty until there's more, I think it's more about using AI as a tool and augmentation to the human element than it is about using it to replace that. Because honestly, if I had used that in many different ways, and I've seen examples in my past company where we've used like AI driven ways to kind of select candidates, like we actually end up missing out on really great candidates. And so there are a lot of nuances that come to finding a great candidate that's not as simple as just being like keywords checked off on a resume. And in some cases, specifically, there have been ways where there have been errors about like location and let's totally remove people from the specific pool. And that was actually an error that happened for one of the roles that we were looking for in a past role that was not picked up. Again, removed a totally huge pool of candidates and actually like affected us negatively because we were actually looking for areas of diversity to make sure that we were building more diverse teams. And so it actually specifically said, oh, this region does not have the specialty that you're looking for, which was actually an area in the country that actually had a lot of engineers, people of color, who we were actually really interested in engaging with. So one of those things we brought to their attention and they were kind of like, oh, we'll look into it, and never heard back about it. Won't name who that is, but yeah, to that point, I think it's like I think it's very interesting and innovative, but I think again, it has to be a balance with the human element until we understand a bit more. Back to that question about like who's actually training it and how do we manage and mitigate bias on who's training, who's inputting that data and where that data is coming from. I think there was, oh, and then we'll get back to you.
We talked about like bias and stuff like that. What do you guys think about like hallucination? I mean, we all know what that means.
No,
right?
I mean 100%. It's a massive issue. I think over 60% of all ChatGPT related prompts come out as hallucination, and I think it's one of the biggest thing. I mean, like we can take HR as an example, right? If you train the system to understand the vacation rules, and you ask the system, hey, if am I allowed to take my vacations into next year? It would tell you, yeah, because there's no in the system or in the data, right? So it's been highly one of our research topics to take the hallucination out and work with confidence level, like all these kind of topics to make sure it doesn't happen. Because that's the real strength of it, if we get those hallucinations out. And I mean, if you, like, for example, I do use ChatGPT too, so I can't say no. But like, I like ask it just to like test it and make sure like I know how to use it. I asked it, hey, can you give me like a quick summarization of Kim Dressendoerfer? And it came up like, yeah, she works at Microsoft. I'm like, hell no. That's like that kind of stuff, right? Because like I once presented at a Microsoft event, so it assumed, you know, and all these kind of things, that those hallucinations are very, very critical. And I'm very curious how OpenAI is going to solve that. But yeah.
I can add something on top of that. I'm pretty interested in that topic as well. I think two things. One is hallucination is when we truly like completely rely on generative model to do all the tasks. So if you ask ChatGPT to give a mathematical calculation, it's not really doing calculation. It's using language to infer what should be the answer, right? But think a better way of ChatGPT can be an agent orchestrating your calculator, your different applications in your computer, and the way that it can work on words and streamline sequence of events with some request for input and output. If ChatGPT can do more on the agent part, like orchestrating different application to do a better good, I think that will remove the amount of hallucination. The other part is, I forgot already, so I will give it to the next question.
If I may just add a couple things here. I wouldn't be good at my job if I didn't shout out Arthur has a product designed to detect hallucinations, but it is a nebulous space, right? Because first and foremost, I would gently like to encourage everyone to stop using the word hallucination, right? There's an anthropomorphization of the word, which kind of inspires us to imagine, or in fact, to think that these models are imagining and thinking when it's not doing that, right? And we're more forgiving, as opposed to another way of saying it would be just wrong, right? generating an incorrect or non-factual response, which I think is totally fair and it's okay to be wrong, right? As long as we talk about it. So that would be the first step is what I think about hallucination. Stop saying it. But then the second part is, well, that was like my biggest point on top of everything that you said. But do talk to Arthur if you want, because this is a massive area, like the risks are bigger than the benefits, specifically when you're asking it for new information or more conceptual kind of answers, right? And we've seen headlines of lawyers who have used it to generate case law that didn't exist, and so on and so forth. And the problem is like poor decision making from, kind of legal training perspective. But it is unfortunate because like when this stuff seems magical, we're inclined to just use it and ask things, and we're encouraging folks to interact with it. And so I think what do I think about it is like we have to talk about it more. And I'm just glad that like as a society, we tend to learn by our mistakes, which is terrible, but at least it's making the news. And we should be more aware, right? Because, and I do agree, like I want to give OpenAI and others, credit because they are working quickly to patch these things as well, and calling out, right? Like I'm only trained up to this year. So if you ask anything past that year, you're just not going to get that information. And I also would just advise everyone here to Google or use your web browser of choice to double check, because you should do that anyway, right? It's all part of like general media literacy. Don't offload completely 100% today, right? It's not ready for that.
I think we have time for 2 more quick questions, and I also want to make sure that we are capturing any questions from the chat. Do we have any from the chat? Okay, so let's get 2 more quick questions. Yeah.
Hi, I kind of have a question more on like general AI. When talking to someone who may not have extensive knowledge on AI, like the general perceived notion is that AI is going to take over jobs and human labor. How can you explain the positive impact that AI has to someone who has AI, who knows AI on a surface level?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I actually think this is very related to the previous question about, or at least like Victoria, about your response, right? Because I think there's a question of public education here of, and I think this is sort of your point around like media literacy, right? Like we have sort of had in the past or broader traditions of media literacy to help people like become informed consumers. Now, to what extent those have been successful, I think is an open question, but I think there is a similar issue here around educating the public around AI's capabilities. So I think one way to go about this is framing it in terms of learning from past data. And I think that actually brings with it, and like that could be an opening into having a conversation about how AI systems might perpetuate historical inequities, society, right? That if we as a culture would like to move forward and address some of these historical issues, building systems that are learning from the past and data that might be sort of reproducing or amplifying these historical inequities is not necessarily going to get us further away from that. I think one other way into that conversation might be about how we've had earlier forms of automation of different kinds. And so, predictive text, right, is something that has been around for a while. And you might talk about like the way that generative models are sort of one evolution of that. And, thinking about these kinds of examples that are familiar in people's lives and are kind of grounded in those interactions people have had before might be one way, but I'd love to hear if others have thoughts.
I can tell a very personal story that's actually happened yesterday. So anyone know the brand called Nasty Pig? If you buy anything from them? Okay, fine. So I went to their pop-up shop during the Pride month, and then I saw one of the executives there and asking, hey, you guys want to use AI or generative AI for your business? I'm passionate about this topic and you're like community brand I want to support. And then yesterday we finally got a 30-minute Zoom call. The first question he has to me was, Ray, do you think AI is going to harm us as a community brand that is more focusing on gay clothing? So, and he also mentioned hallucination. We don't mention that word anymore. So I think that's the general consensus. If you don't know that technology, the first reaction would be fear and doubt. So I give him more bullish view of how like a traditional commercial branding business will not be impacted compared to more digital business, because they do have a physical goods need to be shipped from A to place B, and need to design and produce those clothes. And then I think the story I want to share might not be related to your question is, I am not trying to sell him the software my company is working on. They might use it, but I don't care. I think everyone should influence the people we know in our network outside our professional setup. So if you see any gaps there, people in our community need support to understand this technology and get closer to, well, starting from awareness and understanding so they can join the conversation, and then we can form a more inclusive tech environment for people who is who is more immature in that stage to join us, and then develop a better, more mature mutual communication on this topic in the future.
And then one last question.
First, this has been fascinating. Thank you. As a non-data scientist, what are the most impactful things we can do within an organization to make a push for the responsible use of AI systems?
I will start as a non-data scientist myself. Ask questions. Is your company using AI? What are they using it for? If they are, who have they talked to? How are they, are they monitoring their models? Arthur monitors models. How was it designed, right? Like who was involved? Just all of the normal questions that you'd want to know about anything, right? Ask questions is, I would say, the first point. And then of course, from that, depending on the answers, you can either talk to more people or go online and try to, understand a little bit better. And I think where you have an issue with something, now this will depend a lot on company culture, which ties back to the very first question on building inclusive spaces where people feel comfortable. We very intentionally have these conversations at Arthur, where if there is a company that comes in the door and we're not comfortable with certain applications, short of being deciding whether or not, like, who we will not work with. There are hard lines for sure, but there's way more gray space. But even in those situations, my point here is that, like, if you feel comfortable and you have the safety and it doesn't, imperialize your job security, push back, right? Because I think that you might be working with people who also don't know as much and maybe thought it was a good idea, right? And it's okay to change our minds. And I think, just kind of question, ask why, be like your 4-year-old self.
Sorry, this is IBM commercial. We host like meetings in our offices where it's just about AI and what the tools look like, what you can do with the tools, how you can build your own. They give you like free credits for their subscription and like all these kind of things where you can use the stuff for free for 3 months, and you can build your own algorithms and try it all out, build your own image recognition, everything you want. So that's something I can like probably recommend to everyone. Like, I had no idea I'm going to end up in AI and I'm going to build all these kind of things. It's just started with like, let me just try it out, and I think we all have probably the same kind of story of how we fell in love with AI. And then at the end, it's like, if you see how easy it is to build and what you can do with it and how like the tool is user friendly, where you don't need any coding experience or anything, like it's become so much more fun to play around with it and like find out more about it.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I was struck by the framing of how you introduced it as a non-technical or non-data science person. And I think it's really important to recognize that AI systems are socio-technical. They are both social and technical systems. So for instance, data that models are trained on, data are cultural artifacts. Data are culturally produced in particular situations and societies. There's no such thing as objective data, as neutral data. It does not exist. There's a scholar, Lisa Gettleman, who has a book called Raw Data as an Oxymoron, which I highly recommend. But I think there's a real need in AI development to bring in perspectives outside of computer science, outside of data science, whether that's from the humanities, from the social sciences, from domains, that people are using AI applications across industries, across sectors. There's a real need to feed back information about so AI in education, right? We need educators as part of that conversation. In the public sector, we need, the city governments and public policy as part of this conversation. So I think it's really, really important to think about what you bring to the table, right? Think about this sort of like, asset-based mindset rather than a sort of deficit mindset of like, oh, if only I were more technical or more of a data scientist. I recently gave a talk at a Queer in AI event at a AI research conference a few months back about queering our epistemic identity. So like our identity as AI researchers, I think we often fall into this sort of like binary of like technical or non-technical, right? And that gets perpetuated, people identify across that, but you know, as queer folks, we really should be destabilizing boundaries and binaries wherever we see them. And we shouldn't, you know, buy into this and do this kind of like policing or disciplinary like boundary work to say, oh, I can't have a voice in this process because I don't know enough about X, whatever that is. So I think that would just be my only comment on this.
Yeah, this is another way, one of my favorite lines that reminded me, your part of your answer is experience is expertise, right? So don't discredit your lived experience. It is the expertise of your life, your point of view, that has a place in this. I always tell people, you know, AI models, if they're good enough to make decisions for you, you are certainly good enough to make decisions for them. So you have a voice in this conversation.
Awesome. Sticking the landing on good sayings, quotables. This has been a great panel. I know I've been enraptured by the last few questions, and I think we're at time. Really appreciate your questions and attention. Most of all, want to give thanks for our amazing panelists. Please give another round of applause for Kim, Ray, Victoria, and Michael. I don't want to make promises for them, but I assume they'll be sticking around to mingle. So if you didn't get your question answered, please feel free to chat with them. Again, plug for Arthur. We have a lot of great team members here, data scientists, non-data scientists alike. Happy to talk to you about experiences there if you're interested in AI. And again, we're really excited to be able to be partnering with Out in Tech. Hope this is not the last time. Want to make a huge thank you to Lindsay and Bobby again for including Arthur in this event. And hope everybody sticks around to mingle, have more food and drinks, enjoy the space.